oppression and violence. We have groups with varying degrees of group-based power, and also different cultural contexts from several different continents. All right, so the first one was actually conducted with Kollege Kors here. And this one is about the different intergroup outcomes that are predicted by different construals of collective victimization, focusing first just on inclusive and exclusive victim beliefs, which I briefly mentioned before. So just to briefly define these constructs, exclusive victim beliefs are kind of where the field started with Massino's work on competitive victimhood, as I mentioned before. I then slightly expanded this notion of competitive victimhood to also look at the perceived distinctiveness or uniqueness of the in-group victimization, which is slightly different from claiming that your group suffered more than other groups. You can also perceive that it is something unique, for example, in the world or in a region. So exclusive victim beliefs in our conceptualization can include both competitive victimhood as well as this perceived distinctiveness and uniqueness of the in-groups victimization. And these beliefs are expected to predict negative intergroup outcomes, for example, greater hostility or less willingness to reconcile with the other conflict party. Then in contrast, inclusive victim beliefs are about perceived similarities with other groups' experiences of collective victimization, so acknowledging that other groups have suffered in similar ways, but also it could entail acknowledging that other groups suffered as much as we did. So again, kind of this quantitative and qualitative comparison in both inclusive and exclusive victim beliefs, but we're looking at both together within one construct. And then this belief is expected to predict pro-social intergroup outcomes based on what we know about effects of superordinate categorizations and the general effects of perceived similarity on pro-social attitudes and behaviors. And there has already been a lot of kind of initial research showing these effects, but in the current study, we basically wanted to integrate what is oftentimes just studied one construct at a time and look at it a bit more systematically with regard to different outgroup targets, as I'll talk about in a moment. So here are some examples of the measures we used. Now, just to note, we looked at this in a few different contexts, and we phrased the items to be either about a regional comparison or a global comparison. So depending on the type of violence that the group experienced and also whether or not they are currently in a conflict, inclusive and exclusive victim beliefs could be perceived with regard to comparisons with the other conflict party. But it can sometimes make more sense to ask about comparisons with other groups in the region. And in some cases, such as genocide, victim groups tend to compare their group's fate with other victim groups worldwide, so global comparisons. So in this study, we looked at regional and global, inclusive and exclusive victim beliefs. And here are just two sample items for the exclusive victim beliefs that we had. The conceptual model we then tested was this. So you can ignore the dashed lines for the most part. Those were exploratory, but basically the predictions are that inclusive victim beliefs predict the good stuff and exclusive victim beliefs predict the bad stuff. And we looked at how these beliefs predict both relations with the perpetrator group, the historical perpetrator group, but also relations with other present-day third-party victim groups, if you wish. So specifically, we looked at attitudes towards accepting Syrian refugees into your country, into your community. Those are the pro-social attitudes we examined towards targeted outgroups. And then the hostile attitudes towards targeted outgroups were attitudes supporting Muslim surveillance of Muslims in one society. In addition to testing these effects, we were also interested in looking at predictors of inclusive and exclusive victim beliefs. So what helps us understand in terms of individual differences, who will be more likely to endorse inclusive or exclusive victim beliefs. And so here, drawing on the literature, We predicted that both a universal orientation, so the general tendency to see similarities with others, as well as empathy, or specifically perspective taking and empathic concern, we looked at both, that these individual differences would predict inclusive victim beliefs, and that inclusive victim beliefs in turn would mediate the effects of these more general orientations on intergroup attitudes. Likewise, for exclusive victim beliefs, we expected that in-group superiority, perceiving your group to be better, more moral, etc., would predict exclusive victim beliefs, and that in turn, exclusive victim beliefs would mediate the effects of in-group superiority on negative intergroup attitudes. The samples we worked with in this study are listed here. These were community samples. And the data was analyzed, or I should say Kollege Kos analyzed the data with multi-group structural equation modeling, comparing groups for which we used either the global or the regional comparison measures. So in one case, Jewish and Armenian Americans were put into one multi-group structural equation model. In the other case, Poles and Hungarians were put into another structural equation model. And we found, in general, support for the predicted model, controlling for a number of relevant predictors of intergroup outcomes, such as ideology, in-group attachment, etc. The only paths that were not supported were for Jewish and Armenian Americans, these two red crosses here. There, we only found the expected results for attitudes towards the historical perpetrator group, but not for attitudes towards unrelated outgroups. The reviewers and editor argued with us that the groups, Muslims and Syrians, were perhaps not so unrelated in this context, but who knows what caused this deviation.